Good morning, hello and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us once again for another webinar. This one I'm really interested to get into because it's a program that I've looked into, I've heard a little bit about, so I'm keen to know a bit more about it and the outcomes and future developments. I'll get onto that in a little later on. I'm delighted to be joined first and foremost by Giles Perkins, Head of Profession Future Mobility at WSP. He was the Programme Director for ADEPT Live Labs programme, of which we will be talking about today. Giles, I know you're there. Hello and welcome. Okay, so let me do my admin bit first and foremost, and then we'll get into this. BBA run a webinar every other week. Sometimes we do them every week, but mainly every other week. You should, if you haven't already, signed up and subscribed to the mailing list, which the URL is there on the screen. The reason it's there on the screen is because we make all these slides available via PDF. So in that PDF version that will be available on the website, you'll be able to click on that link. Similarly for the one above it, if you don't want to follow that link, go to the BBA website as the video is showing at the moment. Click on webinars at the top, scroll down, it'll have all the past webinars and all future webinars for you to attend. But the easiest way is to subscribe to the mailing list, and then we can inform you as and when. Okay, a little bit about the BBA. So for over 50 years, 55, 56 years now, the BBA has been helping within construction and manufacturing build confidence in the solutions, the services, the products, the designs, the creations throughout the entire construction supply chain. What the BBA do is look to develop long-term partnerships with their clients, and that helps with continued growth both in the UK and in global marketplaces. Important to note that the BBA will always remain reassuringly impartial. One thing you might not know is that the BBA is actually a for-profit organisation limited by guarantee, which means that the BBA look to reinvest in the industry as a whole for the benefit of you, me, and the entire industry and all stakeholders that are within it. What do the BBA actually do? How do they make this profit? Well, we're more commonly known for PAC, Product Approval Certification, which includes BBA Agreement Certification. That also includes reproduction and HAPA certificates. But one thing or a number of things that people might not know the BBA do or offer services through is things like testing, product testing, audit and inspection, which is interlinked with PAC as well. Management systems such as ISO 9001, 45001, those types. And more recently, UKCA marking, conformity to that, UKTA, and everything that goes with the changes that Brexit is bringing. And more recently than that, a certification that focuses purely on steel reinforcement and that industry. So check out what we do on the website. I'll leave it there. Today, just a bit of kudos for the BBA. Today, we have issued more than 6,000 certificates, represented in 72 countries. The people that work in the BBA are the likes of professors and doctors and very, very knowledgeable people, far more knowledgeable than I am within the industry, and that's why we're good at what we do. We've got over 400 testing methodologies, and we do over 8,000 annual inspections and assessments. So we do back up what we do in our certificates and our testing with those inspections and assessments. That's enough about the BBA. On to today's topic, of which I will let Giles explain a bit more about. Before I hand over to Giles, what we're going to cover today, we're going to have an overview of the Live Labs programme, how Live Labs came to exist, what activities have been undertaken, more importantly, the insights and the learnings that have been gained from them, and then next stage developments and future concepts that might be prevalent in a few years' time. Finally, we'll end on a Q&A. So it's at this point I say, if you've got any questions throughout the entire webinar, please use the chat function or the Q&A function within this webinar to ask those questions. And I promise you, we will answer them. If not at the end of this webinar, we will get back to you via email and answer your questions specifically. That's enough from me. Delighted to hand over to Giles. Giles, welcome. Hello and welcome. So I'm going to put your first slide on, mute myself, and Giles, it's over to you.
Thank you. So, as per my introduction, I'm Giles Perkins. I'm the Head of Profession for Future Mobility. So I spend my days in the innovation space in the transportation and mobility sector. And I'm here today to talk about the work that we've been doing on Live Labs, which is a innovation program for the local road sector, of which I've been program director for. And you'll see on this slide here our partners that have been involved. So ADEPT, as the Association of Directors for Environment Planning and Transport, the governmental body, Department for Transport, Atkins, EY, Kia, O2, Ringway and WSP, who have all contributed to the programme either through funding that they've put into it or their contributions to the commissioning board, which oversees. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a little bit of history. I'm going to talk particularly about what we've learned in an at-scale innovation program. So next slide, please. So what is Live Labs? Well, Live Labs was predicated on how do we accelerate innovation in the local road sector, given the challenges of scarcity of funding, given the fact that lots of technology was coming forward that's promising lots of things. So the Department for Transport, working with ADEPT, we kind of came up with a solution of, wouldn't it be good to have an innovation competition so that people could bring perhaps not mature solutions into the local road sector to prove their efficacy and work towards making them a business as usual. So i.e. sharing the learnings, the findings, the business case, etc., that underpins them so that these things could become normal. So we went out with a very agile competition, a 10-page submission. We shortlisted, we took the shortlisted areas through a Dragon's Den, which had independent experts to assess their pitches, and we ended up with 8 Live Labs, which were announced over 3 years ago. I'll give you a quick trot through what they've all been doing. So Cumbria has been using additives in the tarmac mix, so recycled plastics, etc., to reduce the amount of bitumen that's needed in the road mix, to lock in hard to recycle plastics so that they've got a second life. And that's been doing at-scale trials on bypasses in the centre of Carlisle, on the tops of the fells, in some of the worst places for flooding. If we move down to Staffordshire, Staffordshire focused on air quality, mobility and other innovations, and they actually had an innovation competition within our innovation competition to select their 11 suppliers that they've been working with, everything from e-scooters through to green walls to pull CO2 and particulates out of highly trafficked areas, the use of fibre optics for traffic detection, mobility hubs, pop-up EV charging facilities, very innovative. So really focused on the mobility and air quality aspects. The West Midlands was focused on large-scale data, so using existing sensors and cameras and other equipment out on the network to really understand how traffic was moving, to inform the decisions that are made in their control center, but importantly, doing that through the lens of the different types of users on the network, or the personas, as we call them, of the people traveling around that network. So really informed decisions could be made around how people are moving, how we can keep traffic and people moving and keeping the economy and social things moving, all with a view to the system being used for the Commonwealth Games, which is obviously coming. Central Bedfordshire, one of our very, very large programs, is across the smart materials, mobility, energy and communications. Everything from 3D printed components for lighting columns and bollards, kinetic energy in the roadway, electric scooters, air quality and other sensors, including for adult social care purposes, so using comms networks to protect the vulnerable in their homes and whilst out. All built around data and largely built around Aylesbury Vale as a kind of new town, a garden town environment, to look at how, when you deploy multiple thousands of sensors, you can make a difference to a place. If we go across to, sorry, that was Buckinghamshire. If we go across to Central Bedfordshire has been focused on energy. So using solar energy in car and lorry car parking at council depot. So this is using the vast expanses of tarmac as a solar array when the vehicles are out in the daytime to collect that energy and use it to power the depot. Geothermal energy from underneath the car park in the depot using geothermal probes, and kinetic energy in the pavement outside within the railway estate at Leighton Buzzard railway station, so harvesting footfall energy. So 3 really innovative energy projects working to try and offset that's needed for buildings. If we then move down to Reading, a highly integrated program of sensors, data and detectors using data from Telefonica, who are one of the partners, augmented with new sensors for air quality and pothole detection and electric vehicles and all sorts of things to give a rich view as to what's happening in the Thames Valley, to try and lock in some of the benefits that came about as reduced traffic during the COVID period. Jumping across to the East Coast in Suffolk, a very large program of integrations for sensors in city, urban, and importantly rural environments where there is hard to capture data, hard to capture comms. So places where there's not spots and dead spots, using sensors for everything from road surface temperature through to salt in grit bins, through to gully sensors to detect silting and flooding, to enable them to run the network better, to deliver better outcomes. And then finally, Kent. Kent's taken an integrated approach in developing a new platform for the county, which harvests data from, again, using a large sensor network to deliver better outcomes, but extending it further into what that means for operational regimes such as winter gritting, how they manage their tree canopies, etc. Because Kent has a arguably unique way of funding, because it has what's called a lane rental fund that they can generate revenue from when utilities are intervening in the highway. They've done some really innovative further things with graphene in tarmac in Dartford, the use of drones for doing highway inspections in live environments. So the innovations continue. So across those 8 live labs, we've got a very large portfolio. Next slide, please. So it's a £23 million fund, 8 live labs, activity in 115 discrete locations across England, using 70 suppliers altogether, covering the 4 plus an emerging theme of smart materials, communications, energy, mobility, and, as you would hope, the environment, which is something that has come to the fore over the last 3 or 4 year period. Next slide, please. What this shows is that mix of projects. So a large blue part of the pie chart being communications, orange is energy, grey is environment, yellow is mobility, and light blue is materials, with this mix of suppliers in the horizontal bar chart showing everything from micro mobility to drones to sensors and everything else in between. And we had that one further innovation competition within the Staffordshire Live Lab, and they actually attracted applications from as far afield as Mexico and Australia, 130 people that they went to. So what we've done is kind of innovate and innovate further in terms of who we're bringing into this local roads environment and experimenting with lots of discrete projects. Now, obviously, like everybody else, this ran through lockdown and through COVID, which presented a lot of challenges for us. And what I'm going to do in the kind of the remainder of the presentation is talk about what we've learned on this journey. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So a key part of this for innovation is this is about uncertainty. This isn't about being able to say we expect such and such to happen or we expect these absolute outcomes to happen. Many of these things hadn't been done before. So the key points on briefing and support are having a political champion, which we actually asked our live labbers when they came to pitch to the Dragons to bring a political champion, someone who was going to stand up and stand behind the project and recognise its importance. Briefing senior stakeholders, articulating a simple benefits-based narrative. What are we doing and what do we hope to achieve? But importantly, engaging with legal and procurement early, because this is difficult territory. This is non-traditional in terms of how we were procuring, how we're funding, and also the legal wrappers, especially when you've got the private sector involved with the public sector and academia, etc., all who have different imperatives. And importantly, briefing continually throughout the whole program. Next slide, please. So if we turn to planning and resourcing, our most successful live labs have had a dedicated project management resource, people that were doing this as their near full-time job. And some of those even use their council transformation teams, people who are versed in change, led to successes. Also, not underestimating the project management and other functions to keep innovation projects ticking over. They are uncertain, they wiggle around on that progress chart. But importantly, project managers and other staff need to have the time to think, time to think so that they can get the wider perspectives on what they're trying to achieve. But also importantly, where 2 + 2 could equal something else. The two great examples are Buckinghamshire and Suffolk, who both brought in adult social care activities into their highways live labs because they realized the underlying communications could deliver benefits for those vulnerable customers in their care. We need to capitalise upon private sector skills and setting clear boundaries between the public and private sector. Who's best at doing what and how should they be going about it? Next slide, please. I touched on it, legal and procurement earlier. The need to engage early in innovation just can't be underestimated. The challenges can be immense because we're dealing with uncertainty. It's very difficult when you can't demonstrate what you expect the absolute outcomes to be. It isn't, say, designing a road. It will be 1 kilometre long and it'll be 14 metres wide and it will have a pavement at the side and we expect it to move this many vehicles. We're talking about innovations here that some of them weren't even fully formed when they were awarded and have developed over time. So what we're doing is we're capturing those benefits now, and our live labs are reporting on what they've learned so that others can pick up that innovation and take it elsewhere. But also levering from previous solutions, not reinventing the wheel, actually taking the good, the bad and the ugly of what's happened before and learning from it. And the last point is super important, that difference in pace sometimes between how the public sector needs to operate with its checks and balances and how the private sector wants to operate at pace, particularly when wanting to demonstrate innovation to capture market share. There's an inherent tension in that. And that was difficult at the start, but has really become something that's positive in all parties really understanding their colleagues' different perspectives. Next slide, please. So when we move to the kind of the roles and responsibilities of all those kind of actors on the stage, if you like, it's the clarity between partners and the clarity between teams that brings about that success. Who's doing what and why? And some of our programs have been brilliant at bringing everybody together in almost a weekly basis of having technical meetings, etc., so that people are working together as one team and focusing on outcomes right the way through. The technology is great, but the technology is just a means to an end to delivering those improvements that we want to see: safer highways, more reliable assets, cleverer ways of doing things, etc., that deliver real measurable outcomes, especially when we're talking about many of these interventions could actually deliver cost savings and wider benefits. The commitment to the program, the commitment between the partners is essential. And one of the things that we have really fostered is over the 3-year period is all of our live labs coming together every couple of weeks just to share learning and information between them has been absolutely amazing to see. And that all comes into that one team approach, whether it's the one team at a live lab innovation level or it's the one team as a program. We've had great successes in terms of bringing everybody together. And we've had some really unexpected outcomes of non-geographic locations working together. So, West Midlands working with Kent and Suffolk working with Buckinghamshire, etc., which traditionally doesn't happen. Local authorities may work with their neighbours, but to work remotely hasn't happened so often. So that's been really exciting. Next slide, please. One of the things that we did learn early on was that communications is key to success, telling the stories as we've gone. So we've published a number of white papers, we've got our blogs, we've got news articles that we put out, which is fantastic that we've had a common thread of information, but having the controls, checks and balances around that so that the narratives and the stories are similar and consistent, and especially when this involves major funding from the Department for Transport. So consistency of messaging and campaigning is absolutely crucial. And just touching back to that difference between the private sector and the public sector has certain ways of doing things, and the private sector is much more agile to those approaches, and getting everybody onto the same page, avoiding the pun, in terms of how they work together has been a challenge. But the column inches that we've managed to gain, the international interest that we've had from ADEPT Live Labs has been down to the fact that we've been talking about innovation as we've gone through the process, not just waited until the end to report. We've been very, very open in what we've been doing. Next slide, please. And just resilience and change. Nobody could have anticipated what we would have gone through in terms of the pandemic and what that meant. So we couldn't install interventions out in the highway because obviously highway engineers were doing other things, couldn't do so the ways of working that existed before, but that led to innovation. So for instance, in central Bedfordshire, with the solar arrays that were installed in the depot, the installations were done by staff in central Bedfordshire, but overseen by French contractors using mobile devices. So we're actually doing cleverer ways of doing the install rather than people traveling. We actually use digital ways of doing things. The management of risk has been key. We've been very alert to when things haven't worked, that we turn them off. If there's been failure, we fail fast and move on. So we have made changes to what's been deployed. In certain cases, in terms of the places that have been deployed, we have deployed more things and have managed to achieve cost savings within the program. Also planning for personnel change, the realities of life, people going on maternity leave or people leaving organizations, and having that succession plan, but also managing SME change, where we have had some very small SMEs primarily because of the pandemic getting into difficulties, and how we've had to backfill with others. And that's been a really interesting process for us, is to learn how, when you're considering innovation, to keep that focus on the goal and that things do change, but how we manage scope creep is an absolute imperative. The trouble with exciting programs is that everybody gets excitable and couldn't we just. So we have to manage what we'd set out to do. But it's been as the little graphic shows, it's been a real roller coaster for us, but we've learned an awful lot. Next slide, please. And then the outcomes and reporting right the way through the process. We've had a monitoring and evaluation regime that has been focused on the learnings, on the experiences, and that's been managed by Proving Services from Cranfield University, which we've been doing M&E on a quarterly basis with interviews and self-evaluations, with a focus on the outcomes and the benefits and how we articulate those. Planning the time to evaluate those outcomes has been a challenge, especially because we lost so much time with regards to the pandemic. So many of our programs are now continuing to collect data, and will do so for a long period. If you take Cumbria as an example, it will take years to prove how effective the plastic in roads has been. So that will be a long-term program that carries on. And some of our other programs have now become business as usual with new ways of doing things, so they become part of that day-to-day. And examples include the data for the network in the Transport for West Midlands, the Kent platform, for instance. Many of those other things are now in the day-to-day. And the important part is to share widely, which is what we've been trying to do, and we'll be launching a portal shortly, which will have all of the innovations that we've developed over the period. There'll be the detailed technical reports, there'll be business cases and other things, so that there's a virtual library of information that people can pick up and use in an open source manner, so to apply elsewhere to help become that business as usual, which, wrapping back to the beginning of the program, that was our aim, to make some of these things which were quite tactical into kind of a more strategic business as usual that could be adopted widely. Next slide, please. So that's me. It's been a really interesting journey. I've been in the technology space most of my career, and the things that I've learned along this process have been fascinating. But the big takeaway for me is seeing how teams have worked together within each live lab and collectively as a program, seeing the relationships that's developed and the sharing that's gone on, and the collective learning, I think, has been one of the most fantastic and at times extremely inspiring things that we've seen. We do hope to have a Live Labs 2, which will be, if approved, would be focusing on decarbonisation in local roads. So we await a decision on that. So thank you for listening. I hope you found it interesting, and I'm happy to take questions.
Fantastic, Giles. Thank you so much. Really, really interesting to go into a bit more detail about the different projects that's going on or have happened with Live Labs, and then the fallout from that. One question that I had, actually, you mentioned it just then, the last thing you said. I was like, oh, damn it, should I ask it still? But is there going to be another? And if there is there any time scale? What's the scope looking like that? I know you alluded to it at the end there.
Yeah, we hope to. We've made a pitch to the department to look at Live Labs 2 around decarbonisation. We'll be looking at probably a 3-year program focusing on the harder parts of the decarbonisation journey. So not electric cars and vans. So it wouldn't be the vehicles, it would be scope 2 and 3. So how we construct assets, how we update assets, how we decommission assets, and what that means for carbon. So we await to hear on that one. I think the interesting part is that the learnings that have come out from Live Labs 1 actually are applicable to much of the many other innovation programs that go on. So I spend a lot of my time working on the future transport zone schemes around the country, which is around future mobility. There's been rural schemes, rural innovation funds. There's innovation funds all the time. And I think whilst Live Labs 1 has focused on certain technical aspects, the dare I say it, the management, the softer aspects that wrap around in terms of how you manage innovation and risk and the enthusiasm, etc., around it are highly applicable. So yes, there might be a Live Labs 2, but the learnings are definitely applicable, which is why we're going to open source everything.
Fantastic. That's cool. Good to know. Got a question from Surinder, and he's asking, he says, great presentation, OVS, but he's asking, what percentage of plastic was used in the road trial, and was there a level of focus at a manufacturing level as well as installation?
So we're talking small percentages, and the reports are about to be published, which you'll be able to find. So we're talking single figures of percentage. It's to bulk out that bitumen mix. There's been a couple of different manufacturers have used their products within it, so we could compare against the two. It does come down to it sounds ironic when you're talking about waste materials, but the quality of those waste materials is key in terms of how they perform within that mix. I'm no expert in this stuff at all, but the work that Cumbria have done, the technical reports are going to be highly detailed, which provide a lot of information on how that's gone. So it does come down to the origins of that material. So, clearly there are different grades of that material.
Yeah, that's cool. What's your something that struck me when you were talking about other projects? Have you got a favorite project?
It's like having children, isn't it? They're all my favorite. I think what's interesting is, on the face of it, you could say, well, those projects all feel very, very similar. I spend my day job thinking about use cases and the difference between things. I think what's been very interesting in Live Labs is, if you take something like sensors, lots of our Live Labs have been using sensors and data platforms. What I find interesting, and hence, might say that some are my favorites if I had to, where you're trying to do use cases in really hard places. So like in deep rural places, which are places that have been forgotten because of digital networks, places that are some of the hardest places to solve, like Cumbria doing, plastic in roads on the top of Shap in the Fells, which is one of the worst places for doing that sort of work. Suffolk doing, road temperature sensing and grit bins out in rural areas. you know, the 3D printed lighting column elements has been fascinating, of going through a process to get approval for using 3D printing on something that, you know, you can look out of all of our office windows or your home window and you see street lamps and you're thinking, oh wow, okay, so we can now 3D print those. So there's elements of all of my live labs that I find fascinating. It's back to those, you know, there's 115 locations, there's these myriad of different deployments. I tend to flip-flop because I've found different things interesting at different times. And much of it for me, the interest has come from how the people have gone about deploying the technology and solving the problem, not just the bit of Lego or Meccano in itself. And I think that's the fascinating part. What has been interesting to see that, and I'll give you an example in Suffolk, where because of the international outreach that we've been doing in the press, that they actually had an approach from an American company who said, look, we've got some extra sensors and equipment that we can fit to street lighting columns. We'll come over and we'll experiment with you. So we saw a second wave of other people coming along with other innovations, and that was really exciting when something that we'd done started to get other people interested from other territories who were then bringing their products, which is it was unexpected. It was great.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's end on this question, because I think it's a nice way to end this webinar. And if people are interested in, first of all, what's happened so far, where should they go to get more information, white papers and that kind of stuff? That's the first part.
So if you Google ADEPT, ADEPT Live Labs, that will take you to the ADEPT Live Labs page. Or you can use other search engines if you so see fit. Yeah, and within that you'll find our white papers, you'll find our blogs, and there will be links to the portal that's being constructed at the moment, which will be the main repository of all the information.
And second part of that, if people were interested in getting involved in the second Live Labs, if it was to happen, how would they inquire?
So just watch for press announcements in the press. That if that happens, there'll be announcements made, and we'll use our publicity machine to share that widely in the event of that happening.
Fantastic. For everyone that's listening, thank you so much for your time. Very much appreciated. Giles, thank you so much for joining.
No, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Presenting and answering all those questions. Really fascinating, really interesting stuff. Thanks once again.
Cheers. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.